Well, hello, sexy. What are you doing here? Muggle, under no circumstances touch my booze. Sincerely, Terence. You're not the boss of me, pervert. Oh, that's good. Well, I guess I better stop putting off filming.
What the bloody scum-sucking hell?
Ha! I knew you'd disobey me. Enjoy the polyjuice potion. Love, Terence.
Tara! I swear I'm going to fucking kill you again.
Wait, what do you mean again?
Long story, involves a contradictory plot and a time traveler.
Fair enough.
Turn me back!
Couldn't even if I wanted to. You have to wait out the hour. Plus, I thought you'd enjoy being Kate Blanchett for a little while.
I'm not!
What?
I'm not Kate Blanchett!
Well, who are you then?
How the hell should I know? A blonde American girl.
Huh. I'll call you back, Muggle.
Wait!
I, really need to label these better.
Hello, my beautiful watchers. Hello. Hello, my, I'm starting to understand why Americans always seem to find this so difficult. Hello, my beautiful watchers, and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation, the internet review show dedicated to reviewing how loyal film adaptations stayed to the original plot and themes of the novels they're based on. As you can see, I'm slightly out of my comfort body, but I'm just going to power through that so that we can discuss the infamous Fahrenheit 451 by the late Ray Bradbury and the British film that followed it. Yes, long before HBO made their audience-dividing version starring Michael B. Jordan, and even before Bradbury turned his book into a stage play, two British film companies tried their hand at bringing the story to the big screen. It seems we finally have another case on our hands of a book being more read than the film was watched. However, for those who have not experienced either or read it a long time ago, here's a quick synopsis before the review. Published in 1953, Fahrenheit 451 is a quintessential example of a what-if book, i.e. a story that explores a possible future or alternative present based around usually a single but significant difference to the world as we currently know it. In this case, it's what if any novel worth reading were made illegal by the government in order to dumb down society and make them complacent and easier to control? In conjunction to this, it also works on the premise of what if the job of a fireman was to burn things instead of putting fires out? Put those two things together and you have the role of the story's protagonist, Guy Montag, at the start of the book. A fireman whose sole purpose in life is to track down books that might educate people and reduce them to ashes. In case you were wondering where the book derives its title, Bradbury was allegedly informed by a real firefighter that 451 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which a book would auto-ignite. Whether or not this is actually true apparently depends entirely on what type of paper the book was made of, and a whole bunch of other things, but it's a cool name regardless. Anyways, at the start of the book, Montag, book burner extraordinaire, is on his way home from work and happens to come across a neighbor of his, a teenage girl named Clarice. They end up striking up an odd friendship, and Clarice, through being abnormally free-spirited, makes Montag realize how desperately unhappy he is with his current life. When he finally gets home, he finds his wife has accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills and calls the emergency services just in time to save her. His life continues almost like normal for a while before Clarice suddenly disappears, and Montag learns days later that she was killed in a hit and run. Montag is thrown mentally off balance by this, a state of affairs made worse shortly later by an old woman who, once discovered by the firemen, decides she would rather die with her books than give them up, and lights the kerosene-soaked pages herself while standing in a pile of them. Deeply traumatized, Montag snags a condemned book and takes it home with him, calling in sick to work the next day. His captain, a man named Beatty, comes around to visit him and hints that he might be more aware of what's going on in Montag's head than he would like, telling him that firemen are allowed a 24-hour grace period if they are suspected of owning a book. But if he hasn't destroyed it by then, his colleagues come around and do it for him. Montag reveals to his wife that he's been saving books from destruction for a while now, and hiding them in the house. She panics and tries to destroy them, but he insists on reading every last one. He then goes to visit a man he met years ago in a park, a retired university professor named Faber he had caught with a book but decided not to arrest. Faber, an old and self-proclaimed coward, is invigorated by Montag's new rebellious passion for books, and together they hatch a plan to install distrust in the fire service by planting books in firemen's houses and reporting them. Then, using Faber's contacts in the former literary world to build an illegal printing press and start distributing books around the country. Faber gives Montag a little earpiece receiver to a radio he's built over the years so that they can stay in contact. Montag then immediately fucks up the whole thing when he becomes annoyed at the vapid priorities of his wife's friends during a gathering and insists on reading them some poetry to show them what real feelings are like. This was obviously a stupid thing to do, as his wife's friends and even his wife herself all report him to the firemen. So the next time he goes into work, the fire truck, driven by a clearly annoyed Beatty, takes him back to his own house. Beatty forces Montag to burn it down himself, which he isn't too upset about, and then tries to arrest him, prompting Montag to turn his flamethrower on him as well, and then go on the run. With Faber's help, he makes it out of the city by swimming down a river and almost immediately comes across a group of men who tell him they're social outcasts due to being former educators, and they have taken to saving books by memorizing every word in them before destroying the physical copy. Meanwhile, in the city, the authorities realize they've lost their prey, and not wanting to lose face in the eyes of the public, they show just how dark they really are by killing a random person out for a walk, and just claim it was Montag. The book memorizers invite Montag to join them, and they set off to go and wait however long it takes for the world to be ready to accept books again, even if that means passing books verbally on to future generations. And then most of the world is destroyed in a nuclear war. I'm not joking, that's really how the book ends. I probably should have mentioned that throughout the book, the threat of looming war is brought up pretty often. Bomber jets fly overhead constantly, and it's mentioned in news reports and brought up in several conversations. The government seems keen to assure everyone that a crushing victory is assured for whatever country the book is set in, but as you find out at the end, it's clearly more of a mutually assured destruction style of thing. As Montag and his new friends are walking away, the entire city he just left is reduced to ashes in a single second, and they realize that the time to rebuild a better society has come much sooner than they expected. In a darkly amusing way, the book ends with them stopping to have breakfast before going to do just that. In addition to the cautionary themes of compliance in the face of one's own government, and the terrible potential consequences of allowing knowledge of, and therefore the lessons learned from the mistakes of the past to be forgotten, this book also goes out of its way to drive home the message that ignoring one's own unhappiness for long enough can easily lead to someone becoming subconsciously suicidal. Montag's seeming determination to expose his own crimes, Mrs. Montag taking an entire bottle of sleeping pills without any notion she had done so, and Captain Beatty intentionally putting an incredibly deadly weapon in Montag's hands before trying to arrest him, and provoking him after he had shown signs of being prepared to use it. This is amazingly forward-thinking for a book written well over half a century before things like mental health awareness and self-care would even begin to be understood by the general public. Bradbury's obvious disgust towards the effects of watching too much TV, something that was clearly shared by other authors of the time like Roald Dahl, kind of reminds me of the current hostility towards extensive smartphone use and social media addiction. I'm not saying there's not some truth to it, I just find it amusing that every generation ends up hating and resisting the latest form of entertainment that replaces what came before it. I can't wait to see what I'll end up loathing when I'm an old man. Okay, so while I do appreciate this book a lot, and I enjoyed reading it, and I encourage all to do so, I do have some issues with it. The first is I can't be the only person who feels that ending on nuclear Armageddon kind of makes the rest of the book a little redundant. I mean, I'm just throwing this out there, but how people feel about books is probably going to be less important when you're living in the fucking Fallout universe. Poetry and philosophy are inevitably going to take a backseat to basic survival for a century or two, unless of course it turns out a key factor in who super mutants choose to crush is tied to their thoughts on Dostoevsky. That's even assuming Montag and the book people survive long enough to put their knowledge to any use. I'm not sure if Bradbury was aware of this, but being in close proximity to an atomic blast isn't a recipe for a long, healthy life. Unless these were some sci-fi super clean bombs, it's entirely possible that the book's hero and his friends will all die horrible deaths very shortly after its conclusion from radiation poisoning. This book should probably be called The Shit This One Guy Got Up To Just Before the End of the World as We Knew It. If you watched my review of Rebecca, you might remember I took a dislike to the narrator having such unrealistically detailed fantasies about things. Well, as it happens, there's just one bit in this book near the end where Montag is thinking about what it was going to be like sleeping in a barn overnight. That was very reminiscent of that because it makes a lot of very specific assumptions about what would happen that night and the next morning. By the way, if you're thinking, that sounded a lot like the plot of Equilibrium. Yeah, it's not really a secret that that film was basically a more action-packed retelling of Fahrenheit 451. I, like many other people, was already aware of one of the great ironies of our time, that the book about banning books had been banned in some schools. However, I was surprised to find out that the majority of the cases this occurred, it wasn't because of the controversial themes in the story or the depiction of things like Bible burning, though that was sometimes a factor, but mostly because the book contains swear words, especially because it's not even the heavy stuff. The things said in this book wouldn't even earn it a PG-13 rating these days. Anyways, let's talk about that film. Directed by French filmmaker François Truffaut and released by Universal Pictures in 1966, this film is very 60s. Everything from the fashion to the haircuts to the room decoration exudes that decade from every pore and orifice. The editing in this film is rather odd, especially for a film made in the 60s. There's slow wipes that center on photos of the back of Montag's head, half of the screen cutting off as if it's going to transition but then retreating, rendering it utterly random and pointless, and conversations that cut to a later time in between questions and the answers to them, suggesting that it took someone several hours to form a reply. Incidentally, the film made a big deal out of focusing on photos of the back of Montag's head on several occasions. I'm assuming this was symbolic of something, but I must confess, if that's the case, its meaning was lost on a Philistine such as myself. For similar reasons, I really didn't understand why Truffaut chose to use the same actress for both Mrs. Montag and Clarice, and had to look it up. Apparently, this wasn't always the plan, but was eventually implemented as a way to show that neither girl was the villain of the film, but instead two sides of the same coin. I'll come back to that later. Upon rewatching this film, I was left wondering if perhaps they managed to pull a fast one on 1960s British censorship, as there's a scene of two of the main characters watching a TV show about what appears to be a gay couple planning a party in the house they co-inhabit. Despite the rest of the cast being British, they chose Oscar Werner, an Austrian actor, to play Montag. His accent and nationality is never brought up in the film. It's in general a pretty well-made film for its time, leaving me with few things to complain about in regards to just being a film. So let's get down to the biscuits and talk adaptation. You could make a strong case for the film adaptation-wise. The fireman's new dark purpose, Montag meeting Clarice on the way home from work, his pill-addicted vapid wife who does nothing but watch TV all day, his growing dissatisfaction with the way things are, his captain picking up on it and trying to put him back on the straight and narrow. Mrs. Montag accidentally overdosing, the stoic, disinterested technicians who pumped her stomach and replaced all her blood, the woman who chose to burn with her books, Montag throwing caution to the wind and reading some poetry to his wife's friends, eliciting a strong emotional reaction but driving her to report him to the authorities, being given the task of burning his own books and then burning his captain for good measure, and escaping out into the woods to live with people who preserve books by memorizing them while the government kills some unlucky random guy to hide the fact that they lost a fugitive. There's also a satisfying host of small details the film stayed loyal to. The innocent question of, are you happy, being the slow burn catalyst of the total shift in Montag's life and personality. The pole in the firehouse that carries people upwards as well as down. The symbol of the fireman being a salamander. The rather terrible and probably well worn out joke the book people make about not judging a book by its cover. Montag's eventually aborted plan to hide a book in every fireman's house and then reporting them, thus installing distrust in the fire service and bringing the system down from within. Mrs. Montag's inability to remember where she and her husband had first met. The reason for the lack of interest the technician showed in Mrs. Montag's brush with death being because at least a dozen people in the city overdose every night, so their job had become monotonous, a sad indication of the underlying misery of the population. And the old woman lighting the match for the fire that killed her herself so they wouldn't be able to drag her out of the building.
Do remember to tolerate your friends' friends, however alien and peculiar they may seem to you.
A large change the film introduces from the get-go is it's not just an insanely long list of books that have been deemed illegal, it's reading in its entirety. Newspapers are now wordless comic strips, files on people are just pictures, and stamps and medications are labeled with colors and numbers. This makes for some interesting visuals, but I personally don't think the concept of a modern society that utilizes no words at all could stand up to scrutiny beyond the small part of it that they showed in the film. Possibly for budgetary reasons, the film tones down the amount of destruction the firemen cause, with them performing thorough searches of people's houses and dragging the books out to be burned on metal braziers. In the novel, once it was established that forbidden books were in the house, the property was evacuated and the entire house burned down, partly to make absolutely sure all of the books were destroyed and partly as punishment to the homeowner for having them. Not sure how they dealt with rented property now that I think about it. Speaking as a British man, I have to say, it's rather odd seeing an American story get Anglified instead of vice versa. Though you could make the case that because Fahrenheit 451 never clearly confirms which country it is set in, this isn't a change. Again, speaking as a British man, I noticed a lot of inherently American aspects to the novel that I'm not sure translated well to the new British setting. I won't go into every last one, but just as an example, fully detached houses are a rarity there, even in rural areas. In towns and cities, it would be impossible to burn down a bookkeeper's house without also burning down their innocent neighbors, which certainly wouldn't be popular. As the book starts with Montag on his way home from work, technically the opening scene of the firemen going about their destructive business is a film edition, but it gets a thumbs up from me because it's almost fully in keeping with what the firemen actually did in the books, and it's an excellent way to set up what the film is about using show, don't tell. They gave Captain Beatty a weird habit of referring to Montag in the third person when addressing him.
What does Montag do with his day off duty? Good, Montag might be hearing some exciting news in a day or two. I trust that the thought makes Montag happy.
This isn't the only weird thing about Captain Beatty in this film. They kept the fact that he was unusual for a fireman or even a person in this era because he wasn't ignorant of the books and their content. No, he actually knew quite a lot about what goes on in the pages of the books he burned. But unlike Montag, who fell in love with those words as soon as he reads them, Beatty had come to genuinely hate and resent them and the effect that they had on people. However, while the book presents this with an almost scary intensity and concealed anger from Beatty, the film seemed to want to water him down somewhat. He's nothing but positivity and smiles all the way through, and his rants against books, while containing a lot of the same words as in the novel, are now delivered with a smile and a look that suggests that Beatty is your slightly mad but harmless uncle. This is undercut by the occasional screaming session he partakes in where he physically abuses and berates firemen trainees. I don't know if this was supposed to show hidden dangers in the character, but it kind of just comes off as inconsistent writing. They also dropped the subconscious suicide angle in regards to him. He clearly had no desire to be flamethrowered by Montag as he pulls a piece on him and tries to kill him first. The irony is not lost on me that the British, a country with iron-hard gun control, added such a weapon to an American story that was originally gun-free. The filmmakers were obviously keen to tie everything together in ways it just wasn't in the book. Clarice and the old woman who burned with her books are not only connected to each other, they're also part of the secret society of book-preserving people Montag meets up with at the end of the story. Regarding Clarice, she's definitely the single most changed character in the whole thing. Not necessarily in personality, as she still seems to be a free-spirited blabbermouth, but in motivations and what eventually happens to her. Not only is she one of the book people, making her interactions with Montag a planned recruitment scheme instead of a twist of fate, she's also spared her sudden and wasteful death a third of the way into the story, instead narrowly escaping from a fireman raid and fleeing to join her friends in the forest after coming clean to Montag about her intentions. She's also bumped up in age from 16 to 20 and is a school teacher instead of a school student. This might have been because in the book she was killed off too soon for it to be made clear if there was an age-inappropriate romance developing between them, but if she was going to live to the end of the story in the film, they needed to avoid that issue altogether. The slight problem with this is that they don't really adjust her character to fit this new age, and the actress Julie Christie was 26 at the time of filming, so it comes off a little weird seeing someone that age act like an airheaded child. The sprawling city the book is set in is scaled down to the point where it pretty much looks like Montag lives in the countryside or suburbs, surrounded by fields and other grassy places. In the book, the unlucky person who takes the fall from Montag is just some random guy out for a walk. In the film, you can clearly see he's in a fireman's uniform and he tries to run to the firehouse Montag worked in, so presumably he's one of his former work friends. Harder to cover up for his disappearance, I would have thought. The film, like the book, doesn't specify what year it's set in, but considering considering it removed a lot of the more advanced technology from the story, I'd have to guess it's less far in the future than its written counterpart. The elevated monorail replaces the super-fast subway system of the book, possibly the result of the change from Pack City to suburb. Another change from the book is exactly when Montag started saving books from the flames. If you will remember, he had been building quite the library for himself ages before Clarice finally forced him to admit to himself that he was miserable. The film suggests at the start of the story he genuinely believed in his mission as a fireman to rid the world of the things that cause trouble with their weird ideas. And you see him come around slowly to his entirely new way of thinking as more and more stuff happens that makes him question his understanding of the world. Bradbury's novel also includes a slightly less intense version of the Ready Player One future, where a miserable population retreated into a pure fantasy world made real by technology. In the book, TV walls are exactly that, an entire wall of the house that's a massive TV screen. They were designed so that if you could afford to convert all 4 walls of a room into TVs, you could stand in the middle and the interactive soap opera you're watching would occasionally direct questions towards you or mention you in the story. Montag's wife and most of the rest of the country spent pretty much all of their waking hours in such a room with the volume up to max, only leaving to eat and pop some highly addictive sedatives. The film either didn't have the budget or the creativity for this, so while TVs are still referred to as walls, they're clearly just large TVs. The only time someone interacts with one, it's revealed later to have been just a one-off gimmick and almost certainly a trick. That said, I'm still slightly impressed that a film made in the 60s successfully predicted what a flat-screen TV would look like almost 4 decades before their mass production. I'm slightly disappointed that, even though Bradbury also predicted the invention of Bluetooth headphones, the film didn't follow suit. I mean, for goodness sake, just cut the wires off them, it wouldn't have been hard. As book burners, the firemen's similarities to the Gestapo were already inescapable, but the film still decided to drive away the subtlety by giving them uniforms like you see here. They also seem to have duties and authority outside of book disposal, as they have the right to stop and search at will. Bearing in mind that the original Fahrenheit 451 novel is more of a novelette, containing only 158 pages, and on top of that, a huge portion of the book was dedicated to chronicling Montag's internal awakening, or descent into madness, depending on how you look at it. It's not surprising that the film had to pad things out somewhat. Unusually for an adaptation, it mostly did this by taking its sweet time with every scene from the book. They also take the opportunity to flesh out what the life of a fireman is like too, adding in a training session Montag runs for the new recruits, teaching them the best places to look for hidden books. That Montag and his wife had separate single beds instead of sharing one in the book was an obvious sign of how far they had drifted apart in their marriage. The film portrayed them as not exactly happy, but at least functioning. I'm assuming so it could appear that Montag was giving up more by pursuing his literary interests. There's a new film-only scene in the middle where Montag is gifted a straight razor, which I assumed was building to him using it for something, maybe even as a weapon at the end. But no, this does nothing for the plot. The film decided that in addition to being super hungry after her stomach pump, Mrs. Montag should also be super horny too. Not sure how that works, but it was amusing to see the most PC, non-sexual sex scene in the history of uptight British cinema. There's also a new scene with a bunch of parents playing with their children. I know this was supposed to show just how ruthless and fanatical the firemen were, but it's off book as it shows parents giving a fuck about their offspring. One of Mrs. Montag's friends was a mother, and she reveals she sends them to boarding school 9 days out of 10, and when they do come home, she just sticks them in the TV room and ignores them. There's nothing that implies her attitude towards parenting was atypical for this society. Halfway through the movie, the dual direction pole stops working for Montag. I'm assuming to symbolize how his heart really wasn't in it anymore, but I do have to wonder how a pole managed to be perceptive enough to pick up on that. So there's this other fireman who only exists in the film called Fabian, and he confused the hell out of me because he's all build up and zero payoff. All through the film, you see Fabian witnessing all of the stuff Montag is up to, be it cutting work to spend time with Clarice or sticking books in his bag. There's even a brief moment when you see him dressed as a woman keeping tabs on him at the school he's visiting, though that might have just been this film's weird habit of reusing actors. The problem is, though, all of this leads to nothing. It's not Fabian who brings down Montag, it's Montag's own wife. All Fabian does is smile smugly as they're about to ransack his house at the end. It might have made slightly more sense, or at least have had some sort of resolution, if Fabian had been the unlucky fireman who the police killed to cover up for not finding Montag Montag, but I just don't think that's possible as this guy doesn't have Fabian's gray hair. The film played up the book people in a slightly more goofy way than the novel, in my opinion. Instead of just saying they're the storage unit for the book, they introduce themselves as the book they've memorized, and they seem a tad more quirky than the hardened fugitives of the novel. They're also different from the book version of themselves because the film dropped the plot point that they had cracked a guaranteed method of training someone to have an eidetic memory, so that they could retain a book after just one reading. The movie had them learning the novels through intense long-term study and daily recitals. Honestly, I can't decide which is more unrealistic, the idea that you can learn perfect recall or that you could memorize an entire book without it.
Oh, now, what's all this about?
Gone from the film entirely is another telling sign that the bookless society isn't the happy utopia everyone pretends it is. Gangs of murderous, A Clockwork Orange-style youths that roam the streets trying to kill people in hit and runs, that everyone seems aware of, but don't really care enough to do anything about it. Such a group attempted to murder Montag as he's fleeing the authorities, and after barely escaping with his life, he's tempted to pursue them to see if they are the people who killed Clarice. As I mentioned before, most of the futuristic elements of the book were left out of the film, the most disappointing of which was probably the mechanical Hound. The Hound, as the name implies, is a robotic dog that the firemen kept in their headquarters. It was described as having 8 metal legs and a sharp needle that could extend out of its jaws. Despite that very spider-like description, one can only assume it still primarily resembled a dog, or they probably would have called it something else. The Hound was equipped with powerful atmospheric sensors and analyzers that could track a person's smell for miles, and once it caught up with them, it would deliver either a powerful anesthetic or a deadly dose of poison. The police force and firemen used it to chase down book owners and other criminals. I once again blame budget issues for its absence, and considering how garbage the special effects they did include looked, I'm not entirely sorry they omitted it. I mean, wow. Seriously, guys. So, weird thing. When Faber and Montag are discussing ways to save one of the last Bibles in existence, Faber mentions that even though the Bible is banned now, the population isn't any less religious, but they get all of their doctrine from Jesus himself, played by an actor on TV who occasionally endorses products to his followers. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Thy children must buy the new industrial electric auto floor scrubber, equipped with patented 18-inch floor pads for greater coverage in less time. A steal at $19.99.99. Amen. Yeah, not hard to see why the film decided not to go there. The film also left out the book's upsettingly common cruelty to animals. On quiet nights, Montag and the other firemen would release rats or stray cats into the firehouse and program the mechanical Hound to seek and destroy them, placing bets on how long it would take for it to get them all. Later, Mrs. Montag claims she liked taking their car for drives in the country because she got to run over wildlife and the occasional dog. Wow! Fuck all of these wankers. You may well have guessed, from the lack of mention I've given it, what the single biggest plot device skipped over by the film is. There's no evidence of a war in the film, and the story does not end in nuclear devastation. The only reference to war in the film is an offhand comment about how Montag's wife's friend's husband is in the military reserves. He suggests she should be worried that his current absence means he's been secretly deployed. There's also a single moment early on when you hear a jet flying overhead. The jets were a constant presence throughout the book, and the fact that the population was so disinterested in the fact they were on the brink of all-out war with what one can assume was another superpower really drives home how like cattle they had become in recent years. Though ridding itself of the book's apocalyptic ending did mean it avoided the issues that came along with it that I described earlier, the film does suffer for it as well. I actually saw the film first, and even not knowing what happened at the end of the book, I noticed it lacked a satisfying conclusion, seeming to just stop a good while after the last interesting thing had happened. It was a powerful thing to end the book on, and I think the film should have had the balls to follow suit. The war was also integral to Faber's plan to try to get people back into books, though obviously he hadn't predicted it would be so totally devastating. He expected there would be the occasional conventional bomb dropped on cities, and the resulting deaths would create enough public unrest to open people's minds to the idea of new, or in this case, old things. This isn't an issue for the film though, as Faber is left out too. Some of the conversations he has with Montag are redistributed to Clarice, and the secret society of book printers he was planning to form, that I remind you was completely separate to the secret society of book memorizers, is dropped altogether. In case you were wondering, Faber probably survives the bombs, as he said he was going to take an early bus to another city and would have been en route between them when the nukes hit. But goodness knows how long he would last in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I guess he wasn't essential to the story, though I was disappointed we didn't get to hear him whispering in Montag's ear when he was doing exceptionally stupid things.
Montag! Montag! Stop it, you little dumbass! You're making a right tit out of yourself!
These are so distracting. How did women get anything done? Oh, the Dom's final thoughts. Bradbury himself seems quite charitable towards the film, describing it as flawed but praising things like the directing and soundtrack, and he decided he liked the change that Clarice didn't die so much that he included it when he wrote the stage version of the story. He did, however, voice an opinion that it was a mistake to cast the same woman for both leading roles, and I'm inclined to agree, as I couldn't find anything in particular in the book to support Truffaut's belief that the two characters were, as he claimed, two sides of the same coin, or any hint that this new angle would make for a good addition to the plot. Like with many British film productions, limited funding relative to the insane runaway Hollywood budgets people are used to is a big issue here, and combined with the special effects available at the time, this film never really had a chance of doing justice to the more science fiction heavy elements of the book. There's also the inescapable thumbprints of a director who wants to put his own creative spin on a story, even at the cost of book loyalty, all over this film. Truffaut was kind of a big deal at the time, especially in his own country, and that tends to make someone more inclined to follow their own path than respect another artist's vision. See Stanley Kubrick's The Shining for more info. That said, flaws and all, it's still more loyal to the overall themes of the book than your average adaptation. The only thing I would think a book lover would really hate about it is the bombless ending, so if you can forgive it that, I would recommend seeing it. Hey asshole, did you figure out who you turned me into?
No, well, I mean, yes, but just don't do anything, okay? Don't go outside and don't talk to anyone. I have to go.
Huh.
A huge thank you to Erica for helping out while I've been a little under the weather. If you'd like to see other examples of her work, there's The Thing, or there's a link to her Twitter account in the video description. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, for you see, I am of the Fremen and we use water as currency here on Arrakis. I mean, you can have some if you really want, but I'm not sure how much use you're going to get out of it. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.